Flashpoints, we continue our bi-weekly collaboration, Consortium News on Flashpoints, with a detailed look at the late Senator John McCain, who some remember as a war hero and proud American freedom fighter, and others as a participant in over 30 years of potential U.S. war crimes and related mass murder. We'll be joined by Max Blumenthal, whose August 27th piece for Consortium was titled The Other Side of John McCain, and we'll also speak with AbuKhalil, who writes the piece John McCain, The View from the Middle East, and we'll broadcast a powerful interview with Diana Johnstone, based in Paris. Her piece is The Real Russian Interference in U.S. Politics. I'm Dennis Bernstein with Consortium News, Editor-in-Chief Joe Lauria. All this coming up straight ahead. Stay tuned. I'm Dennis Bernstein. You're listening to Consortium News on Flashpoints. This is a new bi-weekly collaboration between Pacifica Radio's Flashpoint show and ConsortiumNews.com. And joining us from Consortium News is Joe Lauria. He's the editor-in-chief there. Joe, welcome back.
Thank you, Dennis. Good to be back.
Well, it's good to have you with us. We've got a very strong show today, and it starts off with a bit of a different focus on John McCain. Some people who think he is a hero, and there are some people who think that he should be considered a mass murderer and somebody who did not do well for folks in the Middle East. What was your thinking in terms of putting these two pieces that are sort of parallel pieces between Max Blumenthal and AbuKhalil, known also as the Angry Arab?
Yes. Well, to be completely frank with your audience, these pieces were sent in to me. I didn't commission them. But it worked out perfectly well. That Max Blumenthal, that was his first piece for Consortium News. We're really happy to have him on as a regular contributor, writing original stories for Consortium News. And AbuKhalil, the Angry Arab, has been writing regularly for us for a couple of months now. And we're thrilled about that as well. Both of them weighed in from different perspectives on John McCain. Obviously, the country was subjected to days of coverage of John McCain's death and funeral, none of which I saw. But I understood from reading about it what was going on, and you could tell in advance how they would portray him as greater than a hero, as someone, as a man of the century, as some extraordinary figure, when in fact that trail can only be put forth when you omit so much of the man's history. And not only his positions that he took and his votes in the Senate, but his actual globetrotting around the world to get support for some of the most thuggish elements in the world, including Islamist jihadists in Syria and in Libya. And these guys were recruited by him personally, also neo-Nazis or extreme nationalists in Ukraine. They were recruited by him to pursue American interests, American imperial interests around the world. So John McCain really is the face of American imperialism. That's why he was thrust to the public the way he was, in my view, by the corporate media, because of what he symbolizes more than the man that he was. And neither of these two articles really have any ad hominem attacks on this individual. It has to do with his positions and his activities in the Senate for all those years and the great, great damage that he helped bring about, not alone, of course, but in his support of wars in the Senate, in his speeches, and his recruiting around the world of these extremely dangerous elements that ultimately come back often to fight the United States. The Mujahideen in Afghanistan being perhaps the best example when there's a short-term confluence of interests between these extremist groups and the U.S. The U.S. will recruit them and use them because if you're a Mujahideen in Afghanistan and you're fighting the Soviets and the Americans come and say, we'll give you money and arms, even though you hate the Americans, of course you're going to take the money and the arms, and then you fight together the common enemy. And once the Soviets were driven out, of course, you turn your attention against the United States, which was your enemy all along. It was a very temporary alliance. The Americans had to know that. McCain should have known that, and instead we got Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. That's just a small example of John McCain's globe-trotting recruitment of these kinds of awful people and Max Blumenthal lays it out beautifully in his piece. Great detail.
Of course, Max picks it up, interestingly enough, in Arizona with McCain as the keynote speaker in this move to support the Mujahideen. He's not yet a senator. He's just a first-term congressman gung-ho for this. And then, though, we pick it up with the Asud AbuKhalil, and he talks about, well, he comes at it from the perspective of the Middle East. You know, he's a hero here in the United States, but in the Middle East, he's often considered as a mass murderer. This is bookends here.
Indeed. In fact, Assad brings him back again before he was in the Senate when he was the Navy liaison to the Senate and brought senators around the world on various trips. And that's when he became close to Scoop Jackson, Henry Scoop Jackson, probably the godfather of the neoconservative movement, one of the most ardent Zionist supporters. And John McCain learned at the feet of Scoop Jackson. And he had his own background, of course, as a military man with admirals being, both his father and his grandfather being admirals. So John McCain is a man of war, and he learned from Scoop Jackson how to push that through the U.S. Senate. And Assad's piece is brilliant because he starts with this oft-repeated line from McCain to show that he was a great bipartisan man that can reach across the aisle, blah, 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 when he said, when a woman accused Barack Obama of being Arab, and McCain said, no, he's not an Arab man. He's a family man, a decent family man. So Arabs saw that slightly different than the way the corporate media is.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. And we're going to hear a lot about that from Asud AbuKhalil. And let me now focus you on the last piece, which Consortium picks up. This is an old story for Consortium, trying to put the Russiagate frenzy in some kind of a realistic context. And Diana Johnstone sort of asked the question, if there's a collusion investigation, it may be the Russians that want to investigate how the United States is colluding to undermine the running and the welfare of Russians.
Yes, colluding with Russians like Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Yeah, we've had tons of Russiagate stories, obviously, from the time Bob Perry began doing that until now. But not from this angle. This is a new angle from Diana Johnstone. She's looking at what is the exact collusion, as you say, or the way that Russians are trying to influence American policy. And she brilliantly lays out, particularly Khodorkovsky's role in the Magnitsky Act and in getting Resolution 232, which apparently John McCain was involved with that, by the way. We can link McCain even to this story. He was also a co-sponsor of the Magnitsky Act, and he pushed that through the Senate. So we see where these Russians, working also with, of course, William Browder, who was an American but was in Russia and cheated on his taxes and fled the country, and then created this enormously false story about his accountant having been beaten to death in a Russian prison because he wanted to blow the whistle when, in fact, he was an accountant who was covering up his tax abuses. So Diana Johnstone really lays out extremely well and in great detail, again, about how Russians have influenced American policy against Putin, not for Putin, as the allegation is against Trump.
Well, all this is coming up straight ahead on this new collaboration between Flashpoints and Consortium News. This is Consortium News on Flashpoints. Dennis Bernstein with Consortium Editor-in-Chief Joe Loria. Stay tuned. Coming up straight ahead, Max Blumenthal and, well, a different view of John McCain. Stay tuned. And you're listening to Consortium News on Flashpoints. This is a new biweekly collaboration between Pacifica Radio's Flashpoint show and ConsortiumNews.com. And joining us now to talk about a recent article that he wrote for Consortium News is Max Blumenthal. Max Blumenthal is a senior editor of the Gray Zone Project. His articles appear widely. Max Blumenthal, welcome.
Great to be here. And
we're going to talk about the piece you did for Consortium, The Other Side of John McCain. There's been incredible celebration of this man as a hero, as I've heard him call a human rights activist, somebody who's responsible for saving thousands of lives. But your perspective in your article takes a different kind of look at McCain. And you start in Arizona, where McCain is a freshman congressman, and he's beginning to celebrate his relationship with so-called liberation groups, the World Anti-Communist League, and in support of the Mujahideen. You want to sort of set that up for us?
Yeah, I had actually spoken to a journalist friend, Helena Cobbin, who told me this story. She related this really remarkable story to me about her attending an academic conference in the suburbs of Tucson at a resort, which she thought was about U.S.-Soviet relations. And it turned out that she had wandered into a meeting of local kind of Republican anti-communists who were raising money for the Mujahideen, and that she was told there would be a keynote address, and at the main event, basically, these local Republican women were clamoring for everyone to donate money and adopt a muj, in their words, which meant like that you sponsor an individual Mujahideen. The Mujahideen had actually been flown over by one of these CIA programs to actually be on site for the fundraiser. And the keynote speaker was a hard-charging freshman congressman and self-styled war hero named John McCain. And I thought this was, a perfect summation of John McCain's career from start to finish, because McCain, after being shot down in Vietnam by a joint Soviet North Vietnamese SAM battery, basically overseen by a Soviet officer, had sworn eternal hostility against communism, the Soviet Union, anything related to Russia. And he basically gallivanted around the globe, recruiting everyone from, hardline Islamists to literal neo-Nazis in places like Ukraine as frontline imperial U.S. proxies against Russia. And so here he was in his freshman term, already starting out at a fundraiser called Adopt a Muj, and I think it sums up McCain perfectly.
And he was definitely moving around with folks. I mentioned the World Anti-Communist League. These are folks who were borderline fascists. You could call them neo-fascists. They were very dangerous and despicable people, clearly.
Yeah, not just borderline. I mean, John McCain was a member of the World Anti-Communist League. It was like the fascist version of the Internationale, and you had figures like Yaroslav Stetsko, the Ukrainian Nazi who actually personally presided over the deportation of thousands of Jews during World War II. He collaborated with when he collaborated with Hitler's Germany in the occupation of Ukraine. You had Guatemalan death squad leaders. You had Mexican fascists. You had figures like Jesse Helms in the U.S., the extremist neo-Confederate senator from North Carolina. And then you had, for a period of time, John McCain. So, I just ran through all these relationships John McCain had formed from the beginning of his career to the end. And, it paints a picture of someone who was extremely reckless, who actually did pal around with terrorists. His vice presidential candidate, Sarah Palin, who was another kind of cretinous fanatic that McCain brought to the national stage, had said that about Obama. It was completely false, of course. But ironically, if you look at McCain's record, it's really true about him, and it casts the celebrations of his life in a totally different light.
Well, let's talk about some of the things that followed what his career looks like. And maybe we can start with Libya and his relationship to what is now a terrible situation, a failed state based on U.S. policy. Is it true? Did he actually parachute into Libya?
Well, I use that phrase kind of metaphorically.
Okay. Because he could do it, but go on.
Yeah. Well, George H.W. Bush actually parachuted out of a plane when he was like 91, so it's probably doable. I don't.
He didn't do it.
McCain,
okay.
He didn't actually do it. And in media, when like among foreign correspondents, we have a phrase of like parachute journalists who just kind of come into a city or to a conflict zone for like a day or two, and then they immediately go out to file their story. That's what McCain is kind of known for doing as a politician. And my point was that, we're familiar with him thundering for the war in Iraq from the Senate floor. But McCain did much more than other senators. He went above and beyond the call of duty and would actually go to the ground in conflict zones like Libya, where a extremely militarized insurgency led by Islamist affiliates of al-Qaeda, specifically the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, had begun, and McCain went in order to kind of meet with the leader of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, Abdel Hakim Belhaj, and market him back to the American public as a freedom fighter, as a moderate rebel, as someone who, in McCain's word, was not al-Qaeda, when he clearly had been a long-time associate of Osama bin Laden, and had actually gone in one of the later phases in Afghanistan to fight not just against the Soviet Union, but alongside extreme Islamist warlords like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. So McCain really put himself on the line for this character, and what wound up happening was that NATO bombed. The U.S., the Obama administration was partially influenced by McCain to do that. There were many other actors, including the great Samantha Power, who influenced the U.S. decision. But the end result was not just the turning one of the most prosperous and stable states in all of Africa into a failed state where entire parts of the country were ruled by ISIS and other parts were ruled by al-Qaeda affiliates and assorted warlords. It destabilized an entire region. And the arms that flowed from the Libyan military's arm depots went straight into the hands of groups like Boko Haram, the African al-Qaeda affiliate, which then proceeded to overrun Timbuktu and prompt a French intervention. If you remember, Bring Back Our Girls, that whole campaign to rescue these kidnapped African girls who were taken by Boko Haram. There were some 80 of them. That was a direct result of the Libyan intervention. It nearly destabilized Tunisia, which is one of the few success stories, if we can call it that, of the Arab Spring. And then the CIA initiated what former Clinton advisor called the bank shot, which is to take the rest of the arms and ship them into Syria to begin to militarize that insurgency, another place where John McCain metaphorically parachuted into.
Again, talking about Libya, I mean, there was also that horrific assassination of Gaddafi, who was then sort of publicly sodomized. What was McCain's response to that?
Well, I assume he was cheering, and his response was just as celebratory as Hillary Clinton's, who giggled and said, we came, we saw, he died. He didn't just die. He was, first of all, his motorcade in his hometown of Sirte, which was soon overtaken by ISIS, was bombed by NATO armada of jets. A group of Libyan Islamic Fighting Group fighters then set themselves on the motorcade, beheaded Gaddafi's black bodyguards because they were beginning a campaign of ethnic cleansing against the black Libyan population that had been protected and supported by Gaddafi. And then they sodomized Gaddafi in the street with a bayonet, dragged him to his death, and left him to rot in a butcher shop in Misrata for supporters of the so-called rebels to take victory selfies with. And this was, something that was celebrated by Hillary Clinton and presumably by John McCain as well. John McCain took to Twitter and said, "Gaddafi gone, Bashar al-Assad is next." So I guess he wanted another sodomization of a sovereign leader to take place in short order, and he fully expected it. However, there's a thing called the Assad curse that a lot of supporters of the government in Damascus refer to now, and that's a curse on people who had called for the death of Bashar al-Assad. McCain certainly embodies that because Assad wound up outliving him.
Yes, he did. And, I mean, it is interesting. One of the things that McCain did all the way through was to, as you say, legitimize these folks and bring them into Washington, D.C., cleanse them, and get them ready for funding. He did a similar thing in Syria. You can follow it all the way through to the Ukraine. But talk a little bit about his role in Syria and who he was working through. He, as you say, parachuted in there as well.
Yeah. He actually made an illegal visit to Syria at a time when the country was under attack by an Islamist insurgency substantially led by Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate, and ISIS. And it was 2013. It seemed possible that an intervention could take place. The U.S. was prompted actually by Israeli intelligence to adopt the red line policy, that if any chemical attack took place, a red line would be tripped and the U.S. would have to intervene. Well, magically, just weeks after Obama adopted that policy, the Syrian rebels in East Ghouta, who were the Saudi-funded Jaish al-Islam group, alleged that a chemical attack had taken place. Debate begins in Washington. Should we intervene? John McCain adopts a young operative who had been part of the Libyan intervention, lobbying for it in Washington, named Muaz Mustafa, as his personal Sherpa to take him to Syria. Mustafa was then leading a State Department-funded opposition group called the Syrian Emergency Task Force. And Mustafa takes him inside inside Syria to meet some more freedom fighters. McCain meets with Salam Idris, who is then the head of the Free Syrian Army, which is basically a fake rebel group set up by the CIA that was really a weapons farm for al-Qaeda and ISIS. Most of its fighters wound up defecting to extremist groups. And Idris was escorted by several gunmen who were his bodyguards, and two of them posed for a photograph with McCain and Mustafa, and those two were soon identified as kidnappers who had actually kidnapped Shia pilgrims and held them for ransom. These were people that John McCain took photos with. He conducted a press conference. He said, we will meet I hope I will meet you in Damascus someday soon. And, he returned to Washington actually in embarrassment after this story was revealed. I thought this was a rare and refreshing moment in American foreign policy where Jon Stewart was actually mocking John McCain upon his return as someone who was hanging out, palling around with terrorists. That was actually a chyron that Jon Stewart used for his little comedy bit about McCain. And then McCain went back to his district, or back to Arizona, to his state, and at a meeting in Phoenix, a town hall where the war was debated, a Christian Syrian woman stood up and just completely lit into McCain and said, "You are going to expose my people to genocide. I've supported you my whole life, but I can't support you anymore because you're totally reckless and you're going to destroy my country. This is al-Qaeda we're talking about. This is ISIS." And McCain really had no response. And he said, "Well, ma'am, I'm sorry you feel that way." Because McCain never listens to reason when it comes to intervention. When a war is possible, McCain will do everything in his power to market that war and to use his image as this heroic Vietnam veteran and prisoner of war to send more Americans into war. And so this is what he failed to do, however, in Syria. And he harbored this deep resentment, along with many other people in the national security state, against Obama for failing to do to Syria what had been done to Libya. I think many Syrians are really grateful that didn't happen. The country is starting to come back together, and refugees are even starting to return. So Syria was sort of saved from the wrath of McCain.
You're listening to Consortium News on Flashpoints. It's a new biweekly collaboration between Flashpoints and ConsortiumNews.com. We're speaking with Max Blumenthal. He's the author of The Other Side of John McCain, which appeared on Consortium News on August 27th. Max, let's finish this off with a quick look at Ukraine and the fact that he didn't hesitate. I'm not talking neo-Nazis now, right? We're talking about he didn't hesitate to stand side by side with known Nazis.
Yeah, there was actually an op-ed by one of the Washington Post's resident neocon Likudniks, Jennifer Rubin, touting John McCain's human rights advocacy over his life. And the photograph that accompanied this article showed John McCain on stage in the Central Square in Kiev in 2014, Maidan Square, next to Ole Tianbach, who was the co-founder of the Social National Party, which, if it sounds like it was modeled after the National Socialist Party, is because it was. Tianbach had actually been photographed sieg-heiling. He's a literal Nazi, and he was on stage with McCain because he was one of the figures poised to come into power after the elected government of Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown in a coup. And McCain, again, was on the ground to kosher forces like Tianbach and the neo-Nazi right sector. McCain then returned a year later to meet with DNI Pro, which is a right-wing militia which had been involved, according to Amnesty International, in an embargo on civilian areas in the Donbass region, which is where a lot of the fighting is in eastern Ukraine as a result of the disastrous U.S.-supported coup between pro-Russian separatists and the Ukrainian nationalist government, which is sort of oriented towards the West. And McCain went to the base of this right-wing militia, which was involved in human rights abuses, and cheered them on and said, "You're an example of courage, and you're fighting for freedom." It's just like he couldn't stop. He couldn't stop. It wasn't that he was just sending Americans off to war. He was hanging out with Nazis and Salafi jihadi militiamen and cheering them on as well, all the way to the end. And then you look at like his relationship with some of the backers of the extremist forces in Syria and Libya. I didn't even include this in the article, but John McCain had gone on national TV in the U.S. and said, "Thank God for the Qataris, thank God for the Saudis, thank God for Prince Bandar." I don't think any other American is thanking God for these countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, that were operationally involved in 9/11. That John McCain was. And so it really should cast a shadow over over the celebration of his life, and then serve as an indictment of an American media that refused to present the other side of McCain to a public that had been substantially betrayed by him.
All right, well, we're going to leave it right there, Max Blumenthal. Very good and strong piece in Consortium News. The Other Side of John McCain, again, appeared in August 27th edition. Max, we thank you for all the good investigative reporting you do and for joining us on this special edition of Flashpoints and Consortium News on Flashpoints. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on, Dennis.
All right, take care, Max.
All right.
And you're listening to Consortium News on Flashpoints. Coming up next on the show, Professor Asad AbuKhalil, host of the blog news service, The Angry Arab. Stay tuned. And you're listening to our special collaboration, Consortium News on Flashpoints. This is a bi-weekly collaboration between Pacifica Radio's Flashpoint show and ConsortiumNews.com. And we are delighted to welcome to the show now Asad AbuKhalil. He's a Lebanese-American professor of political science at California State University, Stanislaus. He is the author of a number of books, including The Battle for Saudi Arabia. He also runs the popular blog, The Angry Arab news service. Asad AbuKhalil, it is good to have you back on the show.
Nice talking to you again, Dennis. Thank you.
Well, let's talk about John McCain. He's become sort of the human rights hero of America. You've got Human Rights Watch praising him, the U.S. civil rights icon, John Lewis, speaking strongly. You even got Barack Obama showing up at his funeral, and, essentially skipping Aretha Franklin. So, but the Arab view and the view in the Middle East might not fit that description. You want to talk a little bit about this in the context of that now famous famously quoted phrase by John McCain during the stump, on a presidential stump in 2008, referring to somebody accusing, in quotes, Barack Obama of being an Arab, and John McCain saying, "No, ma'am, he's not an Arab. He's a decent family man." And sort of some people took serious offense to that. You want to talk about why?
Well, I mean, it's very obvious that to Arabs and Arab Americans, this sounded highly offensive. This is like saying, imagine if it said, like, somebody is not Jewish, that person is in fact a decent human being, which is exactly what he said. And to his credit, the only one who pointed out at the time in 2008 the bigotry that is contained in the response by John McCain, for which he was highly praised for some reason, even recently after his death, was Colin Powell. He said, this is the wrong answer that guy gave. He should have said, so what if he's Arab? So what if he's a Muslim? But these things did not go along in that way. I mean, I think when we talk about that, the least surprising event that you mentioned was the attendance by Barack Obama of the funeral. I mean, he is not known for his political courage on any issue whatsoever. But I think the liberals of the United States are largely responsible to the elevation of every person who served in foreign war to the level of national and international heroes. John McCain, when he was downed by the Viet Cong fighters, was on his 23rd raid into Vietnam, and he was about to bomb a power station, a civilian target, for which people, if they are foes of the United States and Israel, are accused of war crimes. He was targeting a civilian target, and this was part of the notorious Rolling Thunder campaign, which basically went after targets that had no military or strategic value whatsoever in order to mount pressure on the enemy. And in the Middle East, I mean, the whole Vietnam War is remembered very differently, but there is such liberal guilt in America about the Vietnam War, and for those who felt they did not demonstrate enough emotional support for the troops at the time, that now they try to overcompensate by going overboard in praising anybody who participated in the brutal, savage bombing campaigns of Vietnam.
Let's talk a little bit about his policy in depth. And he certainly was a friend of Israel. His relationship, as you point out, with Scoop Jackson was at the heart of his evolution. You want to describe his relationship? I mean, there was never a war he didn't love, and that there wasn't, that shouldn't have been wider. But talk about that AIPAC connection.
I mean, I must say that I came to the United States in 1983, which is around the time when he started serving in the U.S. Congress, first in the House of Representatives and later in the Senate, succeeding Barry Goldwater, who was far more politically courageous than what John McCain is being praised for. And I have recently refreshed my memory by reading two biographies or rereading two biographies about John McCain. And the thing is, from early on in his career, before he came in Congress, building a political future by he was a Navy liaison officer to the U.S. Congress by associating himself with AIPAC. And for that reason, he politically and strategically picked Senator Scoop Jackson, who was the doyen of the Zionist, ardent Zionists in the U.S. Congress. And he basically credits him for opening his eyes about the beauty and virtues of Israeli occupation and war crimes. And he took him on his first visit to Israel, and of course that was one in series of visits he undertook over these years. And the influence of Scoop Jackson, according to him, was tremendous in making him one of the most reliable AIPAC votes in the U.S. Congress. This guy has a record of 100% in supporting all issues related to AIPAC. And he started voicing his warmongering views very early in his tenure. While he is remembered as somebody who belonged to the Reagan Republicans, these were the team of people who were elected to Congress during the time of Ronald Reagan. But in fact, he opposed Reagan in 1983 during the deployment of U.S. troops in Lebanon. And the reason why he opposed the troop deployment is not because he thought they were bombing civilian targets in Syria and Lebanon, and because it was part of a brutal civil war and for which the United States typically sided with the death squads of the right-wing phalange who massacred Palestinians in Lebanon, but because he felt not enough firepower was used in Lebanon. this is when the New Jersey was being used to bomb villages and towns in Lebanon and the southern suburbs of Beirut. But that was not enough firepower. He wanted more troops in Lebanon and against Syria. He wanted war on both countries. And for that reason, he expressed objection to the mission in Lebanon. And this was a pattern in the long career service of John McCain, which is he always wanted force and massive force used against Arabs and Muslims, but he always argued that not enough force was being used. This is true about what he said about Afghanistan, what he said about Iraq, and even what he said about the response to September 11th. There's an article in the beginning of his campaign in 2008 in the New York Times in which it retells the story how days after September 11th, John McCain was an advocate of launching a simultaneous war against Iran, against Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So there is never enough war for this man. And yet, Human Rights Watch had tributes, several tributes to this man, and had a special memoriam for the man for his human rights services. But then again, if there is anything good about the last few years, is that Human Rights Watch has been exposed to the world, especially to the people of the Arab world, as being a mere arms of the imperialist Western policies of the world.
Well, another sort of misconception that has been promoted in the context of the reconstructing of McCain's image, it's been suggested out there that because he adopted some kind of relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that he was sort of working with both sides there for peace and bringing peace to the region between the Palestinians, possibility, and the Israelis. You want to unpack that?
Right. I mean, there is something sinister about his record and his ties to Islamists in the Middle East, especially in the age of Arab uprising. A man who has never been known to sensitivity to Arabs and Muslims, after the age of Arab uprising, suddenly he associated himself, and I'm sure at the behest of AIPAC, although I do not have evidence, of basically ensuring that Islamists, when they come to power in the Middle East, in Libya, Tunisia, and Syria, as well as Libya, Tunisia, and Syria, and Egypt, is that he wanted to extract a guarantee from the Islamists before they come to power that nothing they will do in power will ever hurt either Western economic and political interests, and two, that they would never antagonize the state of Israel and its occupation. And he succeeded in that. I mean, he got an extraction along those lines from the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood and Tunisian. In Tunis, for example, after the glorious revolution of 2011, the people of Tunisia were democratically demanding criminalization of any form of normalization with the occupation state of Israel. Yet, the Islamists of Al-Nahda party, after coming to perform a pilgrimage in Washington, D.C., and meeting with McCain and WINIP and AIPAC people, basically under pressure from them, they decided to rescind and resist that, and that's what happened. And of course, the central bank of Tunisia was not changed, which was also a request by the United States government. Look at his association in Syria. John McCain has been an advocate of some of the most thuggish and brutal elements of the Syrian rebels. And after the death of McCain was announced, you would never see that in the Western media. Most Arabs on social media were, in fact, sharing pictures of him standing shoulder to shoulder with notorious kidnappers, murderers among the Syrian rebels, and they are remembered in Lebanon for kidnapping innocent pilgrimage on their way through Syria. These were the heroes of John McCain that he wanted to throw more arms and weapons to them. And this is something, of course, that Hillary Clinton was in full support of.
Let me just let people know you're listening to a special edition of Consortium News on Flashpoints. We're speaking with Asad AbuKhalil. He's a professor of political science at California State University, Stanislaus author, and he is he runs the popular blog, The Angry Arab News Service. We're talking about John McCain. I think it would be safe to say that characteristic of John McCain's career is everything that he got involved with, from the military on caused great suffering to civilians. He was shot down, killing civilians, and all the policies that he supported ended up in the slaughter of many innocents across the world and around the Middle East. Correct?
No doubt about that. I mean, he has been an unconditional, wholehearted supporter of massive war and violence against people, brown people around the world. I mean, whether it's military intervention by the United States in Latin America, throughout the Middle East and the Muslim world. And I guess it is this record that prompted Human Rights Watch to pay special tribute to John McCain. There's never been a war that he did not support and that he did not call for expansion of and for more deployment of troops in that war.
You know, when I'm thinking about that phrase again, no ma'am, he's not an Arab, this sort of linguistic racism is prevalent, and it speaks to the entirety of U.S. foreign policy, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, and I think we should also mention here that the man who we should criticize as well for never responding to that insult to millions of Arabs and Muslims is Barack Obama. But then again, when was Barack Obama ever outspoken in criticism that were directed at him that contained a lot of bigotry?
Why would he, forgive me for saying this, but why would he want to speak up? He's not an Arab.
Well, but you should defend people who are being insulted. Millions of people are being insulted by a regime. He should have said something to the effect that I am not one, but so what if I was?
So what if I was?
I would say Barry Goldwater, who he succeeded, who was the right wing as they come, certainly would have been more politically courageous and less bigoted than either McCain or Obama. And I'm no fan of Barry Goldwater.
I'm sure you're not.
But I should say that before his death, he supported gay and lesbian rights and marriage long before Obama or any of the Democrats did.
Well, that is all very interesting. We thank you for taking the time out, Professor. Again, people can find you at the California State University Stanislaus. They can check your books out. There are a number of them. I think the most recent is The Battle for Saudi Arabia. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes, thank you very much.
And they can check you out at the popular blog, The Angry Arab News Service. Thank you so much for the enlightenment on this important subject.
Thank you for hosting me.
All right, take care now.
Bye.
You're listening to Flashpoints and Consortium News on Flashpoints. Coming up next, Diana Johnstone in Paris talks about the Russiagate frenzy. Stay tuned. In Berkeley, I'm Dennis Bernstein. You're listening to another edition of Consortium News on Flashpoints. This is a bi-weekly collaboration between Pacifica Radio's Flashpoint Show and ConsortiumNews.com. And joining us for this edition is Diana Johnstone. Diana Johnstone is a longtime journalist, analyst. She is the author of Fool's Crusade, Yugoslavia, NATO, and Western Delusions. Her latest book is Queen of Chaos, The Misadventures of Hillary Clinton. She also has written notes for her father's memoir, From Mad to Madness. I want to thank you, Diana Johnstone. Welcome back to these airwaves. Good to have you with us.
Well, it's nice to talk to you again.
Well, now, you've written a piece. It's called The Real Russian Influence in U.S. Politics, and maybe we can start out for this overview. And what you're sort of suggesting generally is that if Russia was trying to influence U.S. policy, they really, what they would be doing is trying to stop the U.S. from undermining what's going on in Russia. You want to sort of lay that out for us?
Well, yes, of course. The fact is that the United States has a particularly notorious record of interfering in Russian policy. And, of course, I'm not talking about all of the anti-communist stuff during the Cold War, but particularly in propping up Yeltsin, getting him reelected. Time magazine had a notorious article on that. I mean, I think that's so well known that the Clinton administration used its techniques to reelect Yeltsin when he was dismally unpopular, because precisely he was giving away the resources of Russia, probably not knowing what he was doing, considering the state he was usually in. And of course, so this one of the heroes of that period was this Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who used the weakness of Yeltsin to take control of oil resources and other things too. I mean, they had this racket where he managed to get ownership of things, of major industry and resources, and was clearly involved in selling them, pieces of them, to American firms. He got them for, I think, less than a tenth of their worth, and then was bargaining them up. So the United States was very much involved in this, and the point is that it's not just that the United States was involved in Russia. The United States, it's its policy to be involved in the whole world. It's its ideology. It's that we have this world which must be on the American model, and so they're busy. The American government is busy unifying the world to be on the American, accessible to the United States and so on. And so this thing about Russian interference, it's not only that it's really, the story is pretty absurd. I mean, it's not true, except as somebody has said, the Brennan has accused spies of spying, which is, what they do.
Yeah, and just to stay with that Clinton and Yeltsin and that intervention, that U.S. intervention in the 90s caused extraordinary suffering, didn't it, in Russia?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the life expectancy dropped drastically. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was like it was as bad as a war, as a military war. What was done to Russia with that? It was basically the economy was destroyed. Pieces of it sold off to these what are called the oligarchs, who were just a certain group of people who were well connected in the apparatus, who by various tricks got control of communist, of social industries as their own private, and so it was a disaster of what happened to Russia in the 90s, and of course this was really the proof to Russians, because Yeltsin was calling, my friend Bill. This was really an illustration to the Russians that watch out for American friends, because they came, you see these scenes of Bill laughing and patting Yeltsin on his back, and, the American friends were just ripping the country off completely, and they had a whole policy of breaking it up, and because Russian Federation is very large, and you would break it up, sort of balkanize it on the model of Yugoslavia, and once you have it in littler pieces, it would be easier for Western capital to take control of those pieces. And of course, what happened is that Yeltsin gave up the presidency to Vladimir Putin, who turned that around. And you see, Washington can never forgive Putin for taking their puppet away from them.
Right. Now, let's at the core, or one of the sort of the lightning in the U.S. case against the Russians is this collusion, so-called collusion between Trump administration and the Russians, and the demonstration of that collusion comes up in this meeting, this famous meeting allegedly between Donald Trump Jr. and an official of the Russian government. Do you want to unpack that the way you see that?
Well, I think that is so trivial. The thing is that people, this is supposed to be, in fact, it's the United States idea. This is supposed to be one big unified world. Well, in a world like that, people are meeting each other, for Christ's sake. I mean, it's only normal that these contacts should be happening. That's what a peaceful world is about. And, of course, this is perfectly normal behavior, which is simply being presented to as some kind of horrible conspiracy. Why? Because they need an excuse for Hillary Clinton losing the election. And well, there's two things there. It's the whole Democratic neoliberal machine, which absolutely counted on Hillary being the first woman president, and wouldn't that be a great image, and so on. So carry on the aggressive policies with a woman in charge, and all of that fell apart. So that, plus the fact that one of Hillary's main policies was hostility toward Russia. So they combined those two into this conspiracy of something or other. Of course, now it's obvious that since Hillary was so hostile to Russia, it's natural that Russians would prefer maybe another president, almost anybody else, because they knew how hostile she was, and the other is always an unknown quantity, and, it might be better. But that doesn't mean they did anything about it, because frankly, if you know anything about the Russians and the Russian leadership, they are very conservative. They are not so foolish as to think, we can go over there and we do some tweets and some this and that, and we'll elect a president. I mean, they're not that dumb. And I don't know how Americans be so dumb as to think that they were trying to do that, or that even that they did it. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever.
You're listening to a special edition of Flashpoints in collaboration with ConsortiumNews.com. We're speaking with Diana Johnstone and about her article in Consortium News, The Real Russian Influence in U.S. Politics. Well, Diana, maybe you can help us. One of the things at the core of, Trump supposedly being compromised is this Steele investigation, this Steele document. Could you talk about the document in the context of the role that you call him the fixer, that Jonathan Weiner, a State Department official, a former aide to John Kerry, what role did he play in this with Steele? How does that work? How do you see that?
Well, he said so. I mean, this is no guess. I mean, he's written this. He was a big friend of Steele, and while he was when he came back to the State Department, because he was there twice, when he came back, he was passing along Steele's stories, whatever, regularly. To the appropriate people in the State Department, notably Victoria Nuland, who was responsible for that area. And among these documents was this Steele dossier. Well, that has been written about a lot, about how that dossier was fabricated basically for the Clinton campaign. It was not used in the Clinton campaign, but then it was used, leaked, to justify the investigation of Trump after he won. So, I mean, it's just an amazing thing. I mean, never before have you seen, even before he was taking office, the establishment and the deep state were organized to overthrow the newly elected president. It's incredible. I mean, there's nothing else like it in history. it was never the slightest idea of giving him a chance of anything. It's just that they have been out to get rid of him from the start. But you see, I want to get to the point of my article, because the point of my article is that foreigners are always interfering in the United States. I mean, of course, the interference of Israel is so notorious that I don't know how anybody can fail to notice that they've been interfering in our politics a lot more than the Russians could dream of. But it's not only...
You mean maybe a reference to the fact that the Israeli Prime Minister lectured the U.S. Congress?
Well, exactly. He came over there and they're regularly telling. AIPAC is writing the resolutions that the Congress then unanimously adopts. And of course, why? Because they know if they're not good, there'll be millions of dollars behind the candidate running against them in the next election. I mean, that's pretty obvious. But really, my point is not about Israel, because I think that's so blatant. But the thing is that the United States, Washington, absolutely welcomes foreign intervention by people who want to encourage U.S. interference in the rest of the world. So, you see, the Russians who come to Washington, like Khodorkovsky, with billions of dollars, who managed to get the Magnitsky Act passed, of hostility to Russia. And that's why all Russians who come and say, well, we want to get rid of Putin, well, they can come and interfere as much as they want. And so could Iraqis come and say, or any of these people that come and say, our country is so terribly run, and we all want to be Democrats just like you. Please come and bomb us into power. That sort of thing.
Protect us from Iran, yeah.
Now they are planning, but this happened with Libya. You had these people who absolutely lied about what was going on in Libya. And they come and they say, wonderful America, you're so wonderful. They flatter us. And so that provides the excuses. These people provide the excuses for U.S. Imperialism all over the world. So, in fact, this kind of interference, this kind of people who go to Congress and say, come and help us, they are very welcome to interfere. And of course, that's true also for Russians who also want to have the unipolar world run out of Washington and are ready to sell out their own country. And there are a lot of people who are ready to sell out their own countries, and they're very welcome in Washington and in the Congress.
Well, we're going to have to leave it right there, but we're clear about one thing. That country that has we have colluded most with, or has colluded with officials in the U.S. to undermine U.S. policies, happens to be Israel. And I think that's part of the documents in terms of the PRAFA. The Trump administration National Security Advisor had to sign a PRAFA, and part of the PRAFA has to do with their interference, and they're working with Israel to undermine policies in the U.S. and at the UN. That we know for sure. I'm going to leave it right there. Diana Johnstone, really appreciate you taking the time out. It's a complicated story, but we have tried to tell it best as we can. I want to tell people that you're the author of Fool's Crusade, Yugoslavia, NATO, and Western Delusions, and also Queen of Chaos, The Misadventures of Hillary Clinton. Diana Johnstone, thanks for joining us.
That does it for another edition of Flashpoints. Our executive producer is Dennis Bernstein. Senior producers are Kevin Pina and Miguel Gavilan Molina. Technical director is Mike Biggs. For more information about the show, to listen to or download archived episodes, log on to flashpoints.net. For questions or comments about Flashpoints, you can contact Dennis at dennisjbernstein@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.